The stack of papers sat in the middle of my desk, looking ordinary enough to be ignored. But one glance at the signature stopped me mid-breath. Mine was there, in blue ink, looping and curling in ways that only vaguely resembled my handwriting. The strokes were wrong, hurried, shaky in places where my real signature would be steady. From across the table, Mark leaned back in his chair, phone pressed to his ear, a grin tugging at his mouth. "It's all approved," he told whoever was on the other end, his tone smooth, practiced. He didn't notice the way my attention had frozen on those pages. He didn't know I was reading every clause, every date, piecing together exactly what he'd done. The irony was almost too much. Just days earlier, I'd quietly reached out to our top clients, confirming details and quietly canceling any deals I suspected were being pushed through. Without my knowledge, the agreements in front of me weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Mark thought he was 2 steps ahead. In reality, the race had ended before he even started running. My name is Daniel Wright. I'm 45 years old, and for more than 2 decades, my life has revolved around the business I co-founded. We started as a small logistics outfit with a single truck and a cramped office. Back then, every delivery, every new client, felt like a milestone. Over the years, we grew into a mid-sized firm with reliable routes, repeat contracts, and a reputation for doing exactly what we promised. No shortcuts, no excuses. My role was never glamorous, but it was essential. I handled the negotiations, pored over contracts, and made sure every delivery deadline was realistic and met. Clients came to trust that if my name was on the agreement, the work would be done right. Mark, my partner, thrived in the public eye. He could walk into a room and have strangers leaning in to hear his pitch within minutes. That balance, my operational discipline, and his natural charisma, carried us for years. For a long time, it worked seamlessly. I didn't question his methods because the results spoke for themselves. But somewhere along the way, subtle changes crept in. Contracts landed on my desk already half executed. The fine print barely glanced at. Timelines that should have taken weeks were being pushed through in days. And my once non-negotiable role in final approvals was quietly shrinking, replaced by a string of "don't worry, I've got it" from Mark. It was easy to dismiss at first, but small cracks, left alone, have a way of widening when no one's looking. The first sign that the ground was shifting came about 6 months ago. A supplier contract crossed my desk after it had already been signed. Both our names printed, neatly at the bottom, though only one of us had put pen to paper. When I asked about it, Mark leaned back in his chair and waved it off. "I knew you'd agree. No point wasting time." At the moment, it felt like a small overstep. The kind of thing you chalk up to efficiency. We'd been partners for a decade. After all, surely he wouldn't bypass me on anything that mattered. That no point wasting timeline quickly became a pattern. Each time, the justification was wrapped in charm, as if speed was a virtue and my process was the obstacle. Over the years, I had trusted him to negotiate with clients while I handled the logistics. We both had lanes. Now, he was drifting into mine, assuming decisions didn't need my input, or worse, that my approval was automatic. The turning point wasn't a contract, but a conversation. Over lunch with a long-standing client, I heard about our plans for a new regional expansion. The way they spoke, it sounded like I'd been in every meeting, signing off on every detail. In reality, I hadn't heard a word about it until that moment. The expansion meant committing significant resources, adjusting schedules, and taking on risks I wasn't convinced were justified. When I brought it up to Mark later that day, his response wasn't defensive, it was dismissive. "We can't grow if you're always reading the fine print," he said, smiling like it was a harmless jab. It was a strange thing to process, realizing that someone you've trusted for years doesn't just want a bigger say, but wants to cut you out of the process entirely. Looking back, I remembered the early days, how we would spend hours going over every deal together, debating each clause until we both agreed. That collaboration had been the foundation of our success. Now, he treated my caution as an inconvenience. The stakes were no longer just about business decisions. Every deal he pushed through without me risked our reputation, our financial stability, and the trust we'd built with clients. But more than that, it threatened the balance that had kept us strong. In a partnership, every choice carries both our names, and if one of those names becomes just a formality, the partnership stops being real. When those forged contracts landed on my desk, there was a moment, a very brief one, where I considered walking straight into his office and demanding an explanation. But I knew how that would go. He'd deflect, joke, maybe throw in a half-hearted apology that was really just another dismissal, and then he'd carry on as if nothing had happened. That wasn't going to work this time. So I kept my voice steady, my expression unreadable. On the surface, I treated it like any other stack of paperwork. Inside, I was cataloging everything: dates, client names, payment schedules, clauses that didn't match our usual terms. Each detail went into a separate file, one that never touched the shared system. The pattern was there, and now I had proof. In the quiet of my office, I replayed the moments he'd brushed me off, the deals he'd signed for both of us, the smirk he wore when telling me I was slowing things down. But this time, those memories weren't just fuel for frustration. They were context for a bigger move, because Mark didn't know I'd already been in contact with several of our largest accounts, discussing new terms that required both signatures to remain valid. He didn't know I still had the authority to cancel or amend any agreement that bypassed me. Every smile he gave while thinking he'd outmaneuvered me was another reminder. There was no need to rush. Confrontation would come, but only when the ground was set, and when it did, it wouldn't be about words. It would be about what could no longer be undone. 2 weeks can feel long when you're waiting for something to happen, but when you're the one setting the pieces in place, each day feels deliberate, controlled. My mornings started earlier. Long before Mark arrived, I'd sit with coffee, a stack of files, and a clear objective: trace every contract that had bypassed me and find the truth hiding between the lines. The first anomaly showed up in emails. Clauses were adjusted after my last sign-off, and the changes weren't minor. Payment timelines extended in ways that favored the client, but strained our cash flow. Penalty clauses we'd relied on for years were missing entirely. The language was rushed, sometimes contradicting earlier terms. Every altered document was another thread I could pull. Invoices told the next part of the story. Costs had ballooned on jobs that should have been straightforward. One supplier's pricing had jumped nearly 20% overnight, and the name didn't even match our vetted vendor list. When I cross-referenced the purchase orders, there was no corresponding approval from operations. That was when I brought in Sandra, our operations manager. She had been with us for over a decade. Steady and methodical, together, we lined up delivery logs against the signed agreements, and the mismatches lit up like warning flares. Clients filled in the rest. One in particular, a long-term partner we'd never had an issue with, admitted that Mark had promised them priority rates on a regional expansion. The rate was so far below our break-even point it was laughable, if it weren't so damaging. He'd even hinted that my cautious approach was old-fashioned, implying he was moving the company forward without the drag of my oversight. Every discovery went into a private folder, time-stamped and backed up. I kept parallel records, digital and physical, in case one mysteriously disappeared. Then I called our legal advisor, running through each incident in detail. The response was direct. Per our partnership agreement, any deal signed without both signatures was voidable. No gray areas, no loopholes. The authority to cancel was mine, and mine alone. By the end of those 2 weeks, the picture was complete. I had a clear timeline showing when the first overreach happened, how it escalated, and exactly which deals could be unraveled. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was proof, layered and undeniable, and Mark still believed I was quietly going about my usual work, unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. The first cancellation went out on a Tuesday morning, drafted in language so airtight it left no room for negotiation. I cited the exact clause in our partnership agreement that required dual consent, then politely explained that the contract was therefore null and void. No accusations, no emotional edge, just a clean, professional correction, of course. From there, I worked through the list, starting with the agreements that posed the greatest risk to our margins and long-term stability. Each notice was tailored to the client, concise, factual, and framed as part of a broader operational restructure. I didn't invite debate, but I made sure the tone encouraged continued business under corrected terms. Surprisingly, not a single client pushed back. A few even admitted they'd been uneasy about the original deal and seemed relieved it was being revised. At the same time, I moved internally to close the gaps that had allowed this to happen in the first place. Authorization protocols were rewritten so that no contract, purchase order, or financial commitment could move forward without dual verification. Digital systems were updated to flag any document missing the required approvals, and I arranged for Sandra in operations to receive real-time alerts if something bypassed review. The process was deliberate, almost surgical, each step protected. the company's interests without unnecessarily drawing attention to Mark's overreach. This wasn't about humiliating him in front of staff or clients. It was about stabilizing the foundation before more cracks appeared. Quiet changes can be the most powerful. They shift the landscape without a single dramatic announcement. By the time the last contract was canceled, the business was already operating under a tighter, more transparent system. The damage had been contained, and without realizing it, Mark was now working in a framework where his unilateral decisions were no longer possible. The board had been reset, and the next move would be mine to make. The quarterly board meeting began the way it always did: reports, projections, and Mark taking center stage with his usual polished charm. He leaned back in his chair, talking about our upcoming growth, listing contracts as if they were already locked in and profitable. I let the words flow without interruption. Even when I heard him mention deals I knew no longer existed, there was no satisfaction yet, only the calm certainty that the facts would do the work. When he finished, I asked for a moment to address the board. My notes were neatly stacked, each page marked with dates, clauses, and figures. I started with the simplest truth. Several recent agreements had been canceled, under the authority granted to both partners in our founding documents. I explained why, not in personal terms, but in financial ones: margins that would have been negative, supplier risks, and the fact that none of these commitments had been reviewed by both signatories. The shift in the room was subtle at first. Chairs straightened, pens stopped moving. I could feel the attention move from Mark's confident forecasts to the numbers in front of them. These cancellations, I said, were not impulsive. Each was necessary to protect the company's solvency. Then I handed around the evidence: emails with unapproved changes, contracts missing dual signatures, invoices tied to suppliers we'd never vetted. One of the board members, a quiet man who rarely spoke, finally looked at Mark. "Is this accurate?" The pause that followed was longer than it should have been. Mark's answer came haltingly, the edges of his voice rougher than usual. Some of the details may have been overlooked. It was the first time I'd heard him admit to anything resembling error. Questions came faster after that. Why weren't the agreements reviewed? How many had been signed this way? Could he confirm that every deal he mentioned earlier was still valid? His responses grew shorter, his gaze drifting from one face to another, searching for an ally. The charm he'd always relied on wasn't finding its mark. I kept my tone even, moving forward. "The only safeguard we have is adherence to the process we agreed on from the start. No contract should ever be signed without both signatures." I didn't need to press further. The room had already drawn its own conclusions. When the vote came, it was unanimous. Joint approval would be mandatory for all agreements, no exceptions. Mark gave a small nod, but the look in his eyes was different. The certainty he'd carried for months was gone out as the meeting adjourned. I gathered my papers without hurry. There was no gloating, no glance to see how he'd take it. The outcome wasn't about winning an argument. It was about restoring the rules that should never have been broken in the first place. The authority we now shared equally again felt less like a victory and more like a necessary return to balance. 6 months later, the business looked like itself again. The contracts we had in place were clean, margins were where they should be, and the quiet tension that had shadowed operations was gone. Mark still carried the title of partner, but the guardrails were fixed firmly in place. His energy was directed toward the things he did best: meeting new prospects, delivering confident pitches, building rapport, all without the authority to commit the company without my signature alongside his. Our conversations were minimal and purely operational. No late-night debates over proposals, no whispered promises of fast-tracking a deal. It wasn't personal distance for the sake of punishment. It was simply the right structure for the business. Clients noticed the steadiness. A few even mentioned their appreciation for how thorough things felt lately. Inside the office, the reactions varied. Some team members made a point to thank me privately, acknowledging they'd seen the warning signs long before. Others didn't say a word, but adapted without hesitation to the new dual approval system. I didn't expect or need anyone to take sides. The business was running on the principles it should have never drifted from. That was enough. Mark never offered a direct apology, and I never asked for one. The truth was, this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about protecting something we had built over decades, something that mattered more than personal pride. Deals come and go, but integrity, once lost, is hard to restore. Looking back, canceling those contracts was the surface-level action. The deeper victory was reestablishing the boundaries that kept the company honest. The same ones we'd agreed on when we signed our very first partnership papers. Sometimes the most effective way to respond to betrayal isn't with confrontation or anger, it's with quiet, methodical action, the kind that leaves no question about where the line is and ensures it won't be crossed again.